So, guys, today I talk about law number 18. Do not build fortresses to protect yourself. Isolation is dangerous. First of all, judgment. The world is dangerous and enemy are everywhere. Everyone has everyone has to protect themselves. A fortress seems the safest, but isolation exposes you to more dangerous than it protects you from. It cuts you off from valuable information. It makes you conspicuous and an easy target. Better to circulate among people, find allies, mingle. You are shielded from your enemies by the crowd. Transgression of the law. Qin Shi Huang, the first emperor of China, was the mightiest man of his day. His empire was vaster and more powerful than that of Alexander the Great. He had conquered all of the kingdoms surrounding his own kingdom of Qin and unfilled them into one massive realm called China. But in the last years of his life, few, if anyone, saw him. The emperor lived in the most magnificent place built to the date in the capital of Young. The place had 270 pavilions. All of these were connected by secret underground passageways, allowing the emperor to move through the place without anyone seeing him. He slept in a different room every night, and anyone who inadvertently laid eyes on him was instantly beheaded. Only a handful of men knew his whereabouts, and if they revealed it to anyone, they too were put to death. The first emperor had grown so terrified of human contact that when he had to leave the palace, he traveled incognito, discussing himself carefully. On one such trip through the province, he suddenly died. His body was borne back to the capital in the imperious carriage, with a cart packed with salted fish trailing behind it to cover up the smell of the rotting corpse. No one was to know of his death. He died alone, far from his wives, his family, his friends, and his courtiers. His courtiers, accompanied only by a minister, had a handful of unsures. Interpretation. Xing Huangdi started off as the king of Qin, a fearless warrior of unbridled ambition. Writers of the time described time as a man with a waspish nose, eyes like slits, the voice of a jackal, and the part of a tiger or wolf. He could be mirthful sometimes, but more often a sold man up without a scruple. It was through tricky and violence that he conquered the province surrounding his own and created China, foreign, a single nation and culture out of many. He broke up the feudal system, and to keep an eye on the many members of the royal families that were scattered across the realm's various kingdoms. He moved 120,000 of them to the capital, where he housed the most important courtiers in the West Palace of Young. He consolidated the many walls on the borders and built them into the Great Wall of China. He standardized The country lost its written language, even the size of its cartwheels. As a part of this process of unification, however, the first emperor outlawed the writing and teachings of Confucius, the philosopher whose ideas on the moral life had already become virtually a religion in Chinese culture. On Xinjiang, tea orders thousands of books relating to Confucius were burned, and anyone who quoted Confucius was to be beheaded. This made many enemies for the emperor, and he grew constantly afraid, even paranoid. The execution mounted. A contemporary, the writer Henfei Tzu noted that China has been victorious for 4 generations, yet has lived in constant terror and appearance of destruction. As the emperor withdrew deeper and deeper into the palace to protect himself, he slowly lost control of the realm. Enhanced and minister encouraged political policies without his approval or even his knowledge. They also plotted against him. By the end, he was emperor in name only, and was so isolated that barely anyone knew he had died. He had probably been poisoned by the same scheming ministers who encouraged his isolation. That is what isolation brings. Retreat into a fortress and you lose connect with the source of your power. You lose your ear for what is happening around you, as well as a sense of proportion. Instead of being suffer, you cut yourself off from the kind of knowledge on which your life depends. Never enclose yourself so far from the streets that you cannot hear what is happening around you, including the plots against observance of the law. Louis XIV had the palace of Versailles built for him and his court in the 1660s, and it was like no other royal palace in the world. As in a behave, everything revolved around the royal person. He lived surrounded by the nobility, who were allotted apartments nested around his. Their closeness to him depended on their rank. The king's bedroom occupied the literal center of the palace and was the focus of everyone's attention. Every morning the king was greeted in this room by a ritual known as the laver. At 8 a.m., the king's first valet, who slept at the foot of the royal bed, would waken his majesty. Then pages would open the door and admit those who had a function in the laver. The order of their entry was precise. First came the king's illegitimate sons and his grandchildren, then the princes and princes of the blood, and then his physician and surgeon. There followed the grand officers of the wardrobe, the king's official reader, and those in charge of entering the king. Next would arrive various government officials in the ascending order of rank. Last but not least came those attending the liver by special invention. By the end of the ceremony, the room would be packed with well over 100 royal attendants and visitors. The day was organized so that all the palace energy was directed at and passed through the king. Louis was constantly attended by courtiers and officials, all asking for his advice and judgment. To all their questions, he usually replied, "I shall see." As Saint Simon noted, if he turned to someone, asked him a question, made an insignificant remark, the eyes of all present were turned on this person. It was a distinction that was thought of an increased prestige. prestige. There was no possibility of privacy in the palace, not even for the king. Every room communicated with another, and every hallway led the larger rooms where groups of nobles gathered constantly. Everyone's actions were interdependent, and no one passed unnoticed. The king not only saw to it that all the high nobility was present at his court, wrote Saint Simon, he demanded the same of the minor nobility. At his labor and coucher, at his meals, in his gardens of Versailles, he always looked about him, noticing everything. He was often, if the most distinguished noble did not live permanently at court, and those who showed themselves never or hardly ever incurred his full displeasure. If one of these desired something, the king would say proudly, "I do not know him," and the judgment was irrevocable. Interpretation: Louis XIV came to power at the end a terrible civil war. The foreign principal instigator of the war had been the nobility, which deeply resented the growing power of the throne and yearned for the days of feudalism, when the lords ruled their own fiefdoms and the king had little authority over them. The nobles had lost the civil war, but there remained a factious, resentful lord. The construction of Versailles then was far more than the decadent with whim of a luxury-loving king. It served a circular function. The king could keep an eye and an ear on everyone and everything around him. The once proud nobility was reduced to squabbling over the right to help the king put on his robes in the morning. There was no possibility here of privacy, no possibility of isolation. Louis XIV every yearly grasps the truth that for a king to isolate himself gravely dangerous. In his absence, conspiracies will spring up like mushrooms after rain. Animosities will crystallize into faction, and rebellion will break out before he has the time to react. To combat his sociality and openness must not only be encouraged, they must be formally organized and channeled. These conditions at Versailles lasted for Louis' entire reign, some 50 years of relative peace and tranquility. Through it all, not a pin dropped without Louis hearing it. Keys to power. Machiavelli makes the argument that in a strictly military sense, a fortress is invariably a mistake. It becomes a symbol of power's isolation and is an easy target for its builder's enemies. Designed to defend you, fortress actually cut you off from help and cut into your feasibility. They may appear impregnable, but once you retire to one, everyone knows where you are, and siege does not have to success to turn your fortress into a prison. With their small and confined spaces, fortresses are also extremely vulnerable to the plague, and contagious disease. In a strategic sense, the isolation of a fortress provides no protection and actually creates more problems than it solves. Because humans are social creatures by nature, power depends on social interaction and circulation. To make yourself powerful, you must place yourself at the center of things. As Louis XIV did at Versailles, all activity should revolve around you, and you should be aware of everything happening on the street and of anyone who might be hatching plots against you. The danger for most people comes when they feel threatened. In such times, they tend to retreat and close ranks to find security in a kind of fortress. In doing so, however, they come to rely for information on a smaller and smaller circle and lose perspective on events around them. They lose maneuverability and become easy targets, and their isolation makes them paranoid. As in warfare and most games of strategy, isolation often precedes defeat and death. In moments of uncertainty and danger, you need to fight with this desire to turn inward. Instead, make yourself more accessible. Seek out old allies and make new ones. Force yourself into more and more different circles. This has been the trick of powerful people for centuries. The Roman statesman Cicero was born into the lower nobility and had little chance of power unless he managed to make a place for himself among the aristocrats who controlled the city. He succeeded brilliantly identifying everyone with influence and figure out how they were connected to one another. He mingled everywhere, knew everyone, and had such a vast network of connections that an enemy here could easily be counterbalanced by an ally there. The French statesman Talleyrand played the game the same way. One thought he came from one of the oldest aristocratic families in France. He made a point of always staying in touch with what was happening in the streets of Paris, allowing him to foresee trends and troubles. He even got a certain pleasure out of mingling with shady criminal types who supplied him with valuable information. Every time there was crisis, a transition of power, the end of the Directory, the fall of Napoleon, the abdication of Louis, he was able to survive and even thrive because he never closed himself up in a small circle but always forged connections with the new order. This law pertains to kings and queens and to those of the highest power. The moment you lose connect with your people, sink, sinking, seeking security in isolation, rebellion is brewing. Never imagine yourself so elevated that you can afford to cut yourself off from even the lowest echelons. By retreating to a fortress, you make yourself an easy target for your plotting subjects, who you view your isolation as an insult and a reason for rebellion. Since humans are such social creatures, it follows that the social arts that makes us pleasant to be around can be practiced only with constant exposure and circulation. The more you are in connected with others, the more grateful and at ease you become. Isolation, on the other hand, genders an awkwardness in your pressures and leads of further isolation as people starting avoiding you. In 1544, Duque Cosimo I Medici decided that to ensure the immaturity of his name, he would commission forces for the main chapel of the Church of San Lorenzo in Florence. He had many great painters of choose from, and in the end he picked Jacopo de Pontromo. Getting on his own in years, Pontromo wanted to make these forces his chef d'oeuvre and legacy. His first decision was to close the chapel off with walls, partitions, and blinds. He wanted no one to witness the creation of his masterpiece or to steal his ideas. He would auto-mislead himself when some young men broke into the chapel out of curiosity. Jacopo sealed it off even further. Pontromo filled the chapel's ceiling with biblical scenes, the creation, Adam and Eve, Noah's Ark, on and on. At the top of the middle wall, he painted Christ in his majesty, raising the dead on Judgment Day. The artist worked on the chapel for 11 years, rarely leaving it since he had developed a phobia for human contact and was afraid his idea would be stolen. Pontromo died before completing the forces, and none of them has survived. But the great Renaissance writer Vesari, a friend of Pontromo's, who saw the forces shortly after the artist's death, left a description of what they looked like. There was a total lack of proportion, scenes bumped against scenes, figure in one story being juxtaposed with those in another. In madding numbers, Pontromo had become obsessed with detail but had lost any sense of the overall composition. Vesri left off his description of the forces by writing that if he continued, I think I would go mad and become entangler in this painting, just as I believe that in the 11 years of time Jacopo spent on it, he entangled himself and anyone else who saw it. Instead of crowning Pontromo's career, the work became his undoing. These forces were visual equivalents of the effects of isolation on the human mind, a loss of proportion, an obsession with details combined with an inability to see the larger picture, a kind of extravagant ugliness that no longer communicates clearly. Isolation is deadly for the creative arts as for the social arts. Shakespeare is the most famous writer in history because as a dramatist for the popular stage, he opened himself up to the masses, making his work accessible to people no matter what their education and taste. Artists who hold themselves up in their fortress lose a scene of proportion, their work communicating only to their small circle. Such art remains cornered and powerless. Finally, since power of a human creation, it is inevitably increased by connect with other people. Instead of falling into the fortress mentality, view the world in the following manner. It is like a vast vessel with every room communicating with another. You need to be permeable, able to float in and out of different circles and mix with different types. That kind of mobility and social connect with protect you from plotters who will be unable to keep secrets from you and from your enemies, who will be unable to isolate you from your allies. Always on the move, you mix and mingle in the rooms of the palace, never sitting or settling in settling in one place. No hunter can fix his aim on such a swift moving creature. Image fortress high up on the hill, the citadel become a symbol of all that is hateful in power and authority. The citizen of the town betray you to the first enemy that comes, cut off from communication and intelligence. The citadel falls with easy authority. A good and wise prince desires of maintaining that character and to avoid giving the opportunity to his sons to become oppressive, will never build fortress so that they may place their reliance upon the goodwill of their subjects and not upon the strength of citadels. Reversal. It is hardly never right and propitious to choose isolation without keeping an ear on what is happening in the streets. You will be unable to protect yourself about the only thing that constant human contact with sorry connect content connect cannot facilitate is through thought. The weight of society's pressure to conform and the lack of distance from the other people can make it possible to think clearly about what is going on around you as a temporary recourse. Then isolation can help you gain perspective. Many a serious thinker has been produced in prisons where we have nothing to do but think. Machiavelli could write the prince only once he found himself in exile and isolated on a farm far from the political interests of Florence. The danger is, however, that is that this kind of isolation will desire all kinds of strange and perverted ideas. You may gain perspective on the larger picture, but you lose a sense of your own smallness and limitations. Also, the more isolated you are, the harder it is to break out of your isolation. When you choose to, it sink you deep into its quicksand out your noticing. If you need time to think, then choose isolation only as a last resort and only in small doses. Be careful to keep your way back into society open. So guys, this is law number is 18. Do not build fortress to protect yourself. Isolation is dangerous.